After studying this module, you shall be able to know the different types of overhead variances, learn to calculate the variable overhead variance and fixed overhead variance. Understand the fact that variable overhead cost variance includes variable expenditure variance and variable efficiency variance. Evaluate all fixed and overhead variances. And lastly, identify the subcomponents of fixed overhead variances. Overhead means the sum of indirect material, indirect labor and the indirect expenditure. The calculation of overhead variance is different from direct material and direct labor variance. The overhead variance is calculated separately for the fixed overheads and variable overheads. It should be noted that there would be variation in the rate of fixed overhead per unit even when total fixed cost remains unchanged. Therefore, it is better to determine fixed overhead absorption rate on the basis of normal volume of output. Now we will understand the meaning of overhead variance. We must do the basic calculations before proceeding to the calculation of overhead variances. In this section, we will be developing the different overhead rates to be used later. This section is divided into two subsections. The first section calculates the rate and different overheads when the overhead rate per hour is used, and the second section calculates the rate when overhead rate per unit is used. 1. Calculation of overheads when overhead rate per hour is used. A. Standard overhead rate per hour is equal to budgeted overheads upon budgeted hours. A. Standard hours for actual output will be equal to budgeted hours upon budgeted output into actual output. Absorbed or recovered overheads will be equal to standard hours for actual output into standard overhead rate per hour. Standard overheads will be equal to actual hours into standard overhead rate per hour. Budgeted overhead will be equal to budgeted hours into standard overhead rate per hour. Next, actual overheads will be equal to actual hours into actual overhead rate per hour. Now we will understand the calculation of overheads when overhead rate per unit is used. A. Standard overhead rate per unit will be equal to budgeted overheads upon budgeted output. B. Standard output for actual hours will be equal to budgeted output upon budgeted hours into actual hours. D. Absorbed overheads will be equal to actual output into standard overhead rate per hour. E. Standard overhead will be equal to standard output for actual hours multiplied by standard overhead rate per unit. F. Budgeted overheads will be equal to budgeted output into standard overhead rate per unit. G. Actual overheads will be equal to actual output into actual overhead rate per unit. It is to be noted here that the above calculations will be done separately for calculating the fixed and variable overheads. Let us now understand total overhead cost variance, in short known as TOCV. The total overhead cost variance results whenever there is a difference between actual overhead cost incurred and standard overhead cost for actual output achieved. TOCV undertakes the under and over absorption of overheads. It is to be noted here that the standard overhead cost for actual output can be calculated either by applying the formula of standard overhead rate per hour or by standard overhead rate per unit. TOCV is equal to absorbed overheads minus actual overheads, or standard hours for actual output into standard overheads rate per hour minus actual overheads incurred, or actual output into standard overheads rate per unit minus actual overheads incurred, where standard overheads rate per hour is equal to budgeted overheads upon budgeted hours. Standard overhead rate per unit is equal to budgeted overheads upon budgeted output. When the actual overhead cost is less than the absorbed overhead cost, the variance is favorable and vice versa. Let us understand this concept with an example. Let us calculate total overhead cost variance from the following information. TOCV is equal to absorbed overheads minus actual overheads, or standard hours for actual output into standard overhead rate per hour minus actual overheads incurred. Standard overhead rate per hour is equal to budgeted overheads upon budgeted hours. Substituting the figures, we get 25,000 upon 12,500, that is 2. Standard hours for actual output are equal to, substituting the figures, 12,500 upon 5,000 into 7,000, that comes to 17,500. TOCV will now be equal to 17,500 into 2 minus 30,000 will be equal to 5,000, that is favorable variance. Overhead cost variance is divided into fixed overhead variance and variable overhead variance. It is to be remembered that separate standard rate should be computed for fixed and variable overhead variances respectively. Let us understand both one by one. Variable overhead variance. The variable overhead variance is bifurcated between variable overhead cost variance, that is variable overhead expenditure or spending or budgeted variance, and variable overhead efficiency variance. These are discussed in this section. Variable overhead cost variance, in short known as VOCV. Variable overhead cost variance measures the difference between absorbed variable overheads and actual variable overheads. It is calculated by the formula VOCV is equal to absorbed variable overheads minus actual variable overheads. Let us understand this concept with an example. Calculate variable cost overhead variance from the following data. Let us solve this question. Standard overhead rate per hour will be equal to budgeted overheads upon budgeted hours, that is 5,000 upon 2,500, that comes to rupees 2 per hour. Standard hours for actual output will be computed by the formula budgeted hours upon budgeted output into actual output. Substituting the figures, we get 2500 upon 10,000 into 9,000, that comes to 2250 hours. Absorbed or recovered overheads are equal to standard hours for actual output into standard overhead rate per hour. Substituting the figures in the formula, we get 2250 into 2, that comes to rupees 4500. VOCV is equal to absorbed variable overhead minus actual variable overhead. Again substituting the figures, we get 4500 minus 5500 rupees, we get 1000 rupees, which is adverse variance. The variable overhead cost variance is further subdivided into variable overhead expenditure or spending or budget variance and variable overhead efficiency variance. Variable overhead cost variance is equal to variable overhead expenditure variance plus variable overhead efficiency variance. Variable overhead expenditure or spending or budget variance, this variance arises when there is a difference between standard variable overhead and actual variable overheads incurred. The formula will be variable overhead expenditure variance will be equal to standard variable overhead minus actual variable overheads. We will now understand variable overhead efficiency variance. This variance arises when there is a difference between absorbed variable overhead and standard variable overhead. It is calculated with the formula variable overhead efficiency variance will be equal to absorbed variable overheads minus standard variable overheads. Let us understand this concept with the help of an example. Continuing with the previous example, we will calculate variable overhead expenditure variance and variable overhead efficiency variance. Let us see the solution. We know that standard overhead rate per hour is rupees 2 per hour as calculated. Standard hours for actual output are 2250 hours as calculated above. Absorbed or recovered overheads came to rupees 4500. Standard variable overheads will be equal to standard hours into standard overhead rate per hour. Substituting the figures, we get 2000 into 2, that comes to rupees 4000. Variable overhead expenditure variance will be equal to standard variable overhead minus actual variable overhead. Taking the solution, we got 4000 minus 5500 comes to 1500 rupees, which is adverse. Variable overhead efficiency variance is equal to absorbed variable overhead minus standard variable overheads. Again substituting the figures we arrived at earlier, 4500 minus 4000 will be equal to rupees 500, that is favorable variance. Let us check. Variable overhead cost variance is equal to variable overhead expenditure variance plus variable overhead efficiency variance. 1000 adverse is equal to 1500 adverse plus 500 favorable. That comes to 1000 adverse. Let us now understand fixed overhead variances. In this section, we will divide the fixed overhead variances into expenditure variance, volume variance, efficiency variance, capacity variance and calendar variance. Let us take each one. fixed overhead cost variance FOCV first. It is that portion of total overhead cost variance that arises due to difference between standard fixed overhead cost for actual output and actual fixed overheads. Fixed overhead cost variance will be equal to absorbed fixed overhead minus actual fixed overheads. Let us understand this concept with the help of an example. Calculate fixed overhead cost variance continuing with the previous example. We get the solution standard overhead rate per hour is equal to budgeted fixed overheads upon budgeted hours. Substituting the figures we get 9000 upon 2500, that comes to 3.6. Standard hours for actual output will be equal to budgeted hours upon budgeted output into actual output. Substituting the figures we get 2500 upon 10,000 into 9000, we arrive at the figure 2250 hours. Absorbed or recovered overheads are equal to standard hours for actual output into standard overhead rate per hour. Substituting the figures we get 2250 into 3.6, we arrive at a figure 8100 rupees. FOCV will be equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus actual fixed overheads. Substituting the figures we get 8100 rupees minus 8000 rupees, we get rupees 100, which is favorable variance. FOCV is divided into two variances, that is fixed overhead expenditure variance and fixed overhead volume variance. Fixed overhead cost variance will be equal to fixed overhead expenditure variance plus fixed overhead volume variance. Fixed overhead expenditure or spending or budget variance. It is that portion of fixed overhead cost variance which arises due to the difference between budgeted fixed overhead and actual fixed overheads. If the actual fixed overhead is more than the budgeted, the expenditure would be adverse and vice versa. Fixed overhead expenditure variance will be equal to budgeted fixed overhead minus actual fixed overheads. We will now consider fixed overhead volume variance. It is that portion of fixed overhead cost variance which arises due to the difference between standard cost of overheads absorbed by actual production and the budgeted overhead. If the actual output is more than the budgeted output, the volume variance will be favorable and vice versa. It is calculated with the help of formula fixed overhead volume variance is equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus budgeted fixed overheads. Let us understand this concept with the help of an example. Let us calculate fixed overhead expenditure variance and fixed overhead volume variance with the help of previous example. Let us solve it. We have calculated the following in the previous example. Standard overhead rate per hour 3.6 rupees per hour. Standard hours for actual output 2250 hours. Absorbed or recovered overheads we calculated as 8100 rupees. Standard fixed overheads are equal to actual hours into standard overhead rate per hour. Substituting the figures we get 2000 into 3.6, we come to 7200 rupees. Fixed overhead expenditure variance is equal to budgeted fixed overheads minus actual fixed overheads. Substituting the figures we get 9000 minus 8000, we arrive at 1000 rupees, which is a favorable variance. Fixed overhead volume variance will be equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus budgeted fixed overheads. Now substituting the figures we get 8,100 rupees minus 9,000 rupees, we get minus 900, that is adverse variance. Let us check. Fixed overhead cost variance is equal to fixed overhead expenditure variance plus fixed overhead volume variance. We substitute the figures and we get 1000 favorable plus 900 adverse, we get 100 favorable variance. Fixed overhead volume variance is subdivided into efficiency variance, capacity variance and calendar variance. We will deal with each one of them one by one. Fixed overhead efficiency variance. It is that portion of fixed overhead volume variance that arises due to the difference between the actual output and the standard output expected, arising from the efficiency of workers or plant. It is measured by the difference between absorbed fixed overheads and standard fixed overheads. Fixed overhead efficiency variance is equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus standard fixed overheads. We will now consider fixed overhead capacity variance. It is that portion of fixed overhead volume variance that arises due to the difference in standard and actual output because of under and over capacity utilization of plant and equipment, attributing to factors such as idle time, lockouts and strikes, material shortage, machinery breakdown, labor turnover, etc. It results due to the difference in the actual working hours as compared to budgeted. It is expressed as fixed overhead capacity variance will be equal to standard fixed overhead minus budgeted fixed overheads. Let us consider the fixed overhead calendar variance. The fixed overhead calendar variance arises when there is a difference between the number of working days in the budgeted period and actual number of working days to which the budget is applicable. The organization takes into account all the normal holidays in due course of business in a particular country while laying down the standard. However, the difference may arise between the actual working days and the budgeted working days because of unexpected and exceptional circumstances such as national tragedy, death of national leader, etc. We calculated by using the formula fixed overhead calendar variance is equal to actual number of working days minus standard number of working days into standard rate per day, that is revised budgeted hours minus budgeted hours into standard rate per hour. This variance would be adverse when there are extra holidays and favorable in case of extra working days. However, the probability of extra working days is very less. It is to be remembered that whenever calendar variance is calculated, the calculation of capacity variance has to be modified and thereby revised capacity variance should be calculated. Revised capacity variance will be equal to actual hours minus revised budgeted hours into standard rate per hour. Let us calculate efficiency variance and capacity variance in example 5. Fixed overhead efficiency variance is equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus standard fixed overheads. Substituting the figures, we get 8,100 rupees minus 7,200 rupees, we get 900 rupees, which is a favorable variance. Fixed overhead capacity variance will be equal to standard fixed overheads minus budgeted fixed overheads. Substituting the figures, we get 7,200 rupees minus 9,000, we get minus 1,800 rupees, which is an adverse variance. Let us check. Volume variance will be equal to efficiency variance plus capacity variance. We will substitute the figures and see 900 favorable plus 1800 adverse. We get 900 adverse. Let us now summarize and understand what we have learnt in this module. Number 1. TOCV is equal to absorbed overheads minus actual overheads, or standard hours for actual output into standard overhead rate per hour minus actual overheads incurred, or actual output into standard overhead rate per hour minus actual overheads incurred. 2. VOCV is equal to absorbed variance overheads minus actual variable overheads. 3. Variable overhead cost variance will be equal to variable overhead expenditure variance plus variable overhead efficiency variance. 4. Variable overhead expenditure variance is equal to standard variable overhead minus actual variable overheads. 5. Variable overhead efficiency variance is equal to absorbed variable overheads minus standard variable overheads. 6. Fixed overhead cost variance is equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus actual fixed overheads. 7. Fixed overhead cost variance is equal to fixed overhead expenditure variance plus fixed overhead volume variance. 8. Fixed overhead expenditure variance is equal to budgeted fixed overheads minus actual fixed overheads. 9. Fixed overheads volume variance is equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus budgeted fixed overheads. 10. Fixed overheads efficiency variance is equal to absorbed fixed overheads minus standard fixed overheads. 11. Fixed overhead capacity variance is equal to standard fixed overheads minus budgeted fixed overheads. 12. Fixed overhead calendar variance is equal to actual number of working days minus standard number of working days multiplied by standard rate per day, or revised budgeted hours minus budgeted hours into standard rate per hour.